Hi, I'm Terry Ord from the School of Biological Earth and Environmental Sciences from UNSW in Sydney. So the clip that you can see on the screen right now is a montage of video clips of male carabine anolis lizards performing these territorial broadcast displays to advertise territory ownership. And the reason why I've got it on the screen here is because this montage kind of summarizes what I'm really interested about in terms of animal communication. And it's trying to explain the diversity that we see in the way animals design their social signals. Now, in the context of these carabiner anoles, you can see that all the species are using these push-ups or head bobs together with this throat fan, or what we call a dewlap. And yet, although they're using the same two components, they're putting those visual displays together in very different ways, so very diverse ways. The really interesting thing here is that obviously, because these are all territorial broadcast displays, the function of these signals is exactly the same for all these different species. And we know that the function of a signal will determine its overall design as well. So when we see examples like these carabiner anoles where the same signal is being used for the same purpose, for the same function, why do we see such diversity in the way those different species put those signals together in terms of the signal design? Now, a lot of research these days is, the current focus is on what we call contemporary adaptations. So I think, if you were looking at closely related species using the same visual signal in the context of the same territorial advertisement display, perhaps they differ across species because those different species live in different environments. And this is a big deal for animal communication because a social signal is only as effective as it is conspicuous in that environment. So in the case of, divergence by environment, we've got wonderful examples in cichlids and darters where the light environment for these fish will determine the types of colors that are most visual to mates. And this determines the type of colors that are used in those wonderful ornaments. But it's not just the physical environment as well. It can be the social environment. For example, if competition for territories or mates increases, there is often divergence and increasing complexity in those species to accommodate that increased competition through sexual selection. Examples are in these birds' paradise in terms of both their songs and dances. And divergence can also occur within species, so populations living in different environments can diverge depending on the properties of those environments to make sure that those signals remain conspicuous. And this is a wonderful example in the greenish warbler here, which is a ring species. The flip side of divergence, of course, is convergence. So when distantly related species move into a similar environment, or at least exposed to a common selection pressure, they often evolve the same adaptive solution to that selection problem. Now, in terms of animal communication, it's quite hard to actually come up with some really nice examples of adaptive convergence across different species, which is unusual because animal communication is really intimately tied to the environment, as I've alluded to. But the examples I've got up on the screen here are classic examples of adaptive divergence. Being cryptic, so animals such as beach mice and various different species of lizard matching the substrate that they typically occur in to try and avoid detection by visually oriented predators. The wonderful architecture of spider webs in Hawaiian spiders, depending on the type of prey that those different species are trying to catch. Now, if I was going to try and find examples of convergence in animal communication, I think a really nice example are the alarm signals in many birds, these SID alarm calls. Now, I don't think they've formally been defined as convergent in those different species, but certainly the design is very similar across those different species of birds. And it certainly is convergent when we start comparing to ground squirrels, which also use an alarm signal. So the idea here is that the design of that signal can be detected by nearby conspecifics, but not by the predator, which is further away. So it's very specific to that function. And you can see that, at least in terms of the seat call, the alarm call in birds relative to ground squirrels, they're remarkably similar in terms of their overall design. So these, divergence on one hand or convergence on the other, this is an example of contemporary adaptation or natural selection or sexual selection overriding that baggage of evolutionary history. So the flip side is historical contingency, started out in the paleo world with people like Stephen Jay Gould. And the notion is that because there are so many random and chance events in evolutionary history, lineages will ultimately go on to alternative trajectories and evolve alternative outcomes simply because of those chance events in their history. So if you were to replay the tape of life, you would invariably get a different evolutionary outcome in each instance because of these random chance events in evolutionary history, which is conflicting with this notion of ecological determinism, where selection overrides that baggage of past history. So typically, it's ecological divergence versus historical contingency. But really, if you want to understand present day diversity in terms of phenotypes, but in particular in animal communication, we do really need to consider both of these. And we really haven't been really thinking a lot about historical effects and how that shapes the trajectory of adaptive evolution in animal signals. And this is the focus of what I'm going to talk to you just now about. So this it's important because basically if you have different starting points, in many instances, species will probably evolve alternative adaptive solutions to that same selection problem. So rather than traditional convergence, we have this many-to-one forms to function, which is something that the functional morphologists and biomechanical and anatomical researchers are exploring. So basically, the evolution of alternative designs in response to a common selection pressure. Now, as I'll progress through the talk, hopefully this will become a little bit more clear in the context of animal communication, but it's equally applicable for our understanding of the evolution of animal communication. So I'm going to start with some really focused examples here. So the first one is one I've already introduced, these caribou and anoles lizards, where these males are producing these broadcast displays using head bobs and dewlaps. And if you actually look at the variation of some really basic elements of design here, just the duration of those displays, you'll see that across closely related species, there seems to be a split. There seems to be those in green that have really long displays, certainly in terms of their head bobs, but also their dewlaps, compared to the ones in orange here that have a lot shorter displays. So there seems to be alternative strategies for these territorial broadcasts. And if we overlay the phylogeny for these species, we find that those groups actually belong to separate clades. So there's a separate radiation throughout the eastern Caribbean, which are in the green, relative to the ones that are radiated through the western Caribbean, which are in the orange. And these correspond to these apparently alternative forms of visual displays, short versus long. But it gets bigger than that. So if we actually focus in on a subset of those species in each of those clades, we find that those in green have a lot of contextual plasticity. And what I mean here is they're essentially tailing the design of their territorial advertisement display, depending on the prevailing conditions that experienced. Habitat, light, but also visual noise from windblown vegetation, all impact the detection of these visual displays in these Caribbean anoles. In contrast, those that are from the orange clade, represented here by Jamaica, often have very little to no contextual plasticity, but they tend to have, on average, a lot faster elements, in particular, the extension of that dewlap, which is, on average, a lot faster in the orange clade than it is in the green clade. And the significance will become obvious in just a moment. In addition to that, there's differences in the timing of when these displays are produced. The ones from the green clade tend to wait for calm periods in the environment, so when visual noise from windblown vegetation is at its lowest, before performing their advertisement displays, whereas those from the orange clade don't seem to really care at all. And there seems to be a link again with that speed of that dewlap. So those species have particularly fast dewlaps are tending not to worry about what the environmental noise might be compared to those that are in the green. And we know that the dewlap is particularly important for an effective display because we've done robot playback experiments with the caribou and anoles, and we've found that a really effective way to alert surrounding receivers in the environment, so territorial neighbors that you're performing your advertisement display, is by rapidly flicking out that dewlap at the start of the display. It's a wonderful orienting device. The alternative is that lizards can actually do high-speed head bobs, but that's energetically more expensive. And so what appears to have occurred here is that we have these two clades. One clade in the green tend to produce costly energetic displays compared to those that are in the orange. They seem to have the more optimal display design in terms of something that's energetically quite cheap to produce. There aren't any differences here in terms of habitat, social environment, and predation that would determine those differences between the clades. And it appears to be something that's in this evolutionary history of these two clades that set the two clades onto alternative adaptive strategies. It seems to be related to that dewlap, right? So we've actually had a look at the anatomy of that dewlap. We've come up with various biomechanical models that essentially model the way lizards could change the anatomy of that dewlap to maximize the speed. And I'm not going to go into detail about these biomechanical models other than to say that you can use them to model different scenarios about what sort of innovations would have to occur in the anatomy of that dewlap to have a high-speed dewlap extension. And when we look at the actual anatomy of these different species, by having a look at those hyoid apparatus, which is in the throat, the picture on the screen here is what you're seeing is the bottom of the lower jaw. We can measure the anatomy of this, and we find that it all boils down to a fulcrum ratio. So think of a seesaw. It's essentially what a dewlap is. And the innovation, however, is specific to the muscle contraction velocity. There's been an innovation either in terms of the number of muscle fibers or the overall size of that muscle that's powering the dewlap extension that is allowing that orange clade to go on to a completely different adaptive trajectory. So the innovation appears to have occurred in the orange clade, but not the green clade. And as a consequence, the green clades still have to produce conspicuous territorial displays, and they've had to come up with alternative innovations in terms of duration of displays, that contextual plasticity, and the timing of the displays to make up for the fact that they can't produce rapid extensions of the dewlap. So if we actually have a look at the hyoid of of lizards across the entire family of iguanid, which is with where Anolis is nestled within, we find that the dewlap has only evolved once. There has been some contention here that perhaps it's evolved in other groups as well, but when we've actually had a look at the anatomy of the dewlap, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. If we look at the closely related family of agamids, we have a huge amount of diversity in the anatomy of that hyoid, and also a lot of diversity in throat ornaments. We've got these wonderful frilled red lizards and bearded dragons in Australia, but we've also got the independent evolution of the dewlap in at least two other groups, Satana, which I'm not going to talk about today, and Draco, Southeast Asian lizards, which I am going to now focus on. So what we have here is we have the evolutionary tree that we just showed, but now it's flattened out, showing the independent origins of that dewlap. This is what it's like in the caribou and anoles that we've just been talking about. And this is what it looks like in the Southeast Asian Draco. Thing to note here is that both of these groups are using head bobs and the extension of this dewlap for the exact same reason, for territorial advertisement displays. But again, you can see also in Draco that they're putting those movements together in very different ways depending on the species. So we've got this variety. So now I'm going to have a focus on the Draco dewlap. We'll compare it first with the Anolis and the hyoid. You can just have a look here. You could do some funky phylogenetic comparative methods, statistics, and map adaptive landscapes and such. But all you really need to do is look at that hyoid structure in yellow to see that Draco have come up with a very different design for that dewlap compared to the Anolis. There are consequences with that alternative underlying morphology in terms of overall area. What we find is that the size or the area of the dewlap in Draco is effectively capped to a limit, whereas the anoles can actually have a larger dewlap area. And this is important for signal detection and the amount of information that can be encoded in that dewlap in terms of the pattern and the color of that dewlap. So Draco have actually come up with an alternative. They've actually evolved these kind of flanges that come out the side, so a three-dimensional dewlap, if you will. And so this kind of constraint is illustrated nicely in this still from a video. This is Draco melanopogon. You can see that dewlap starting to scrape along the tree trunk. So that's the cap on the overall area of that dewlap, and it's specific to the morphology of that hyoid. And the compromise is that they've evolved these flanges outside this three-dimensional dewlap to make up for that constraint on the overall area. So there's an innovation here that's resulted from that kind of many-to-one form to function scenario. So I've been studying Draco for over a decade now, and they're a fascinating group for a variety of reasons. But if we step back for a moment, the evolution first of that head bob is very ancient. It has a common ancestry in both the guanid and agamid families, and it evolved roughly 140 million years ago. In Draco, of course, we've had the independent evolution of the dewlap at about 30 to 60 million years ago, roughly about the same time that that dewlap evolved in the caribou Anolis. But subsequently, in a small subset of Draco species in Southeast Asia, have now lost that head bob entirely and superseded that dewlap as the only means of territorial communication. Now, that's remarkable because the head bob is almost ubiquitous across these lizards, right? And it's ancient. So for it to be lost in this particular group is really, really unusual. And it appears to be something to do with changes in overall body size. So that subset of Draco that have lost their head bob also tend to be larger species. I won't go into detail about why that's the case, other than to say that it's a combination of character displacement and ecological competition driving increases in species body size. But if you're bigger in your body size, it's more costly for you to produce that head bob component. So it seems that it's got to the point that it's too costly, and these lizards have lost the head bob entirely and now rely exclusively on that dewlap. Now, they've lost a lot of information potential because they no longer include that dewlap, right? That head bob. So the consequence should be that there should be some sort of elaboration to that dewlap to kind of increase the potential information transfer from that dewlap. So the number of colors and the patterns of colors. And when we do compare across those Draco species, we do find that subset of Draco that now lost their head bobs have more complex dewlaps, apparently as a consequence. But if we compare the complexity of that dewlap to the caribou anoles, that both have the dewlap, of course, but also the head bob, so they retain that head bob, that complexity really isn't very special. So those Draco that have lost the head bob component are still at a compromise in terms of the level of information transfer that they can potentially convey just using that dewlap. So that's some really interesting outcomes going on here. So if we step back for a moment, caribou anoles, one clade has that innovation relating to the muscle contraction velocity, but that one that's in green did not have that innovation. So they've been constrained to have to come up with alternative innovations in terms of duration and contextual plasticity to make up for the fact that they still need to have a conspicuous display. Southeast Asian Draco, there's that constraint in terms of selection for increased body size, but now they can't perform those head bobs efficiently, so they've lost them, and the innovation has occurred to some extent in the elaboration of the complexity of the color and pattern of their dewlaps to make up for that loss of the head bob. So the hyoid apparatus is very different between Anolis and Draco, and that the way that hyoid morphology anatomy has evolved has dictated some constraints on the overall size of that dewlap in our Draco, and they've had to innovate by having the evolution of these flanges, a three-dimensional dewlap, to make up for the fact that their hyoid has constrained the overall size and area of that dewlap because of the way it's evolved. So to what extent is this actually broadly relevant for animal communication? I'm just going to give you a few random examples to illustrate that it's a big general phenomenon in animal communication. Think of the Darwin finches. You may be aware that each of the islands in the Galapagos has a different species of Darwin finch. And each of those finches tend to have different morphologies of their beak, and that reflects natural selection resulting from the type of food resources that they're feeding on, large seeds versus small seeds, insects versus grains, all results in differences in the beak morphology. And beak morphology has a huge impact on the types of vocalization birds can actually produce. And so this constraint of the beak morphology has resulted in a lot of diversity in the types of songs that are produced by Darwin's finches across the group. Another example, which is a little bit more outfield, so in swordtail fish, females love males with an elongated sword from their tail. And what's really interesting is that researchers have discovered that species that are related to swordtails, where males don't have the sword, still prefer males with the sword artificially attached, even though that sword has not evolved in that species. So this is really controversial because it appeared to imply that females have a preference for an ornament that doesn't actually exist in males. So how can that possibly evolve? The answer turns out to be relatively straightforward. Females actually don't really care about the sword per se. They actually are selecting males based on overall body size. Bigger males are more preferred. There's a constraint on males in terms of how big they can get. So they've evolved this cheat of elongating their sword out of the tail to appear larger to females to tap into that hidden bias. Something very similar has evolved in sailfin mollies. Again, females prefer larger males. There is a cost for males to produce larger body size in terms of developing it. So they've instead elaborated that dorsal fin into this wonderful sail to appear larger to females to tap into that preference that they have. So this constraint on body size, selecting for innovations in ornamentation. This wonderful study that came out over a decade ago, where the researchers had a look at all acoustic communication being produced across the animal phylogeny, and they discovered that depending on the body size, or more specifically the metabolic rate of a species, you can actually predict really precisely what the frequency, rate, duration, and volume of those acoustic signals that are produced in social communication. So much so that any species that is deviating off that trend line has evolved some sort of innovation to escape that constraint of body size and metabolism. And it's remarkable because it's really a powerful model that predicts how animals should communicate, and yet it's kind of not really been leveraged to be able to explore the evolution of innovations and vocalizations. This notion of recursive evolution, this is in essence that past natural selection or sexual selection will dictate the evolutionary trajectories of lineages that descend from that ancestor. Woodpeckers are a wonderful system, so they use the drumming to communicate to one another. And sexual selection has selected for different types of rhythms for the drumming. Now, the thing is that once a certain rhythm has evolved, it constrains that lineage to only then be able to tailor the design of the speed and the cadence of those drummings, depending on what's allowable within that particular rhythm sequence. So past selection has set these lineages onto different adaptive trajectories, and hence you'll get lots of diversity in the drumming patterns across these close related species. So this notion that constraint is not interesting and not important, it's just, kind of like baggage, is unfortunate because we really do need to consider these historical factors and even past selection if we really do want to understand present day diversity in animal phenotypes in general, but specifically for animal communication more specifically. And I think it's super interesting as well because what you discover is this many-to-one form-to-function notion that the functional morphologists are investigating. It's equally applicable to animal communication. And what it means is that you discover how selection generates innovation in animal signal design. So we're able to get a lot of rich information on how selection generates changes in signal design by taking this kind of historical approach. And with that, that's all I have for you today. And we'll just end with these two videos of Draco in Southeast Asia and the Anolis in the Caribbean. Love to hear from you. My email is up on the screen as well.